Good morning, all. I'm once again wearing my floral spring top, but this time I think it's actually happening, at least for a couple days. We're not going to get too hopeful, but I'm glad you came out here on this beautiful sunny morning. Well, first of all, if you don't know me, I'm Dr. Jacob Rohrm. I do public programs here at the History Center. And when I first got the opportunity to curate this series, our guest today was one of the first people I thought of. I'm a little biased to admit he was on my dissertation committee. So, but I had the opportunity to learn from him in a seminar on Indigenous history. And I've just been impressed with his ability as an educator, his scholarship, particularly his most recent book, The World and All the Things Upon It, which is for sale in our bookstore. I highly recommend it. It's a whole history of Native Hawaiian exploration, sort of flipping the trope of Hawaii and Hawaiians being the ones discovered, and instead saying, no, they were the ones discovering their world and setting up their own geographies and exploring the entire globe. So highly recommend you check it out. And today's lecture is a little different. Sometimes we hear from folks who are talking about a completed project. Today's topic is kind of a spin-off, if you will, is that correct, of that last book, sort of continuing the research. And so I'm really excited. This is new stuff. This is not something you're going to be able to find in the bookstore yet, but maybe in the future. So let me introduce my speaker and we'll get going. So Dr. David A. Chang is a distinguished McKnight professor in the Department of History at the University of Minnesota. So it's nice to have someone local. He's a Native Hawaiian historian of Indigenous people, colonialism, borders and migration in Hawaii, especially on the histories of Native American and Native Hawaiian people. He is the author of the award-winning books, The World and All the Things Upon It, and previous to that, The Color of the Land, which is about, is the Creek? Yes, the Creek and in Oklahoma, what's now Oklahoma. So very interesting. But please give a great welcome here to Dr. David Chang.
Good morning. Aloha. It is nice to be here. Aloha mai kako. May there be aloha among us. Thank you, Dr. Jacob Rohrm. It was really a privilege to be here. It was a privilege to be part of your instructional team at the University of Minnesota at the other end of University Avenue. And it's just really exciting to be able to speak here to you folks and at the Minnesota Historical Society. I've been a longtime member and admirer of this organization. In the line of work that I do, and I suspect, given the interest that I bet that you have, you spend a lot of time at historic sites and historic homes and museums and historical societies around the country. And when you do that, you see what we have here in Minnesota, and you see that it's special, and you see that it's worth holding on to and worth continuing to build. It's you know, I'm a proud product, and I've been of educational systems around the country, but there's really kind of nothing like the infrastructure that we have around education and around culture here in the state of Minnesota. I consider MNHS to be a crucial part of that, and I hope that along with our other institutions, our other public and public-facing institutions, we continue to build them. And I'm really glad to have this chance to be in this space and to talk to you. Now, the subject, love, death, and rivers, may not sound promising for a sunny morning, but I hope that it will, because here's the thing, is I think that what I'm talking about, I'm not going to mince words, I think it's beautiful. I think it's exciting. And I hope that you'll catch some of that as I begin, because I'm going to start, paradoxically enough, with a song about a person who died. And it's a song called the Kanikau. In the Hawaiian language, in our language, Kanikau is in our tradition, is a song that you write for somebody who's passed away. It's a lament, it's a celebration, it's a tribute, right? And it also helps their spirit on into the next phase of human existence. And on May 4th, 1865, Kanu Pepaku Oko'a, which is a Hawaiian language newspaper, which was published in Hawaii, in Honolulu, the capital of the independent kingdom of Hawaii, published a letter. And it published the words to a song by a man named Thomas B. Kamipele. It was a remarkable letter, and it was an even more remarkable song. So Kamipele was who? He was a Kanaka. You'll hear me say that word. It means native Hawaiian person in the Hawaiian language. He was a Kanaka and he was a fisherman. And he lived at a place called Vernon, California. So I put that red dot there north of Vernon. And Vernon is located at the confluence of the Sacramento River and the Feather River. And in this song, which they printed for him, he sings in mourning for the spirit of his deceased wife, whose name was Nisenan. She was a native Californian woman. The song is worthy of attention in its own right because it's a piece of human art. It's beautiful, it's moving. But the song also is an important historical document. It can open up for us a view onto confluences of history between Native Hawaiian and Native Californian people, and the sometimes different ways that Native Hawaiian and Native Californian people remembered their histories flowing together, just like this river. So it's an amazing document, I said. It's a poem of love, it's a poem of loss by one indigenous person to another in the mid-19th century. We don't have many documents like that, so it's precious. Let me just read you the beginning, the prose opening to it, if I may. Sinamae died September 7, 1864, a woman native to this land of California, who lived with the native Hawaiians after the arrival of Captain Sutter here in Sacramento. She gave birth to many children with her Hawaiian husbands. Most of them, the children, have died. One, Sarah, remains. Then she married me, and we too have one child together who is alive. Therefore, I have composed a mourning song for her, a kaniko. Here's how it begins. My dear woman, from the stillness of California, from the cold wind of the Northwest, it's a small wind, but it numbs my entire body. My body aches with love. When I look, you, the woman, are gone. I cannot see the parents of the child. You've just gone, left us two behind. Here I am with our ache. Go heavenwards, upland from the sea. I want to talk to you about Sinamayan. I want to talk to you about Kamipele, and I want to talk to you about this song, and I want to use it as a way to launch into discussion of memory. By memory, I mean history, yes, but I also mean something more. I mean something about the sense that we make of the past. Academic historians, but each and every one of us. And when we write, when we remember a beloved spouse who's passed away, we're engaging in important memory work, right? We're saying, what did that person mean? And what do I want the future to know about that person? That's what I mean by memory. I want to take history, but I want to go bigger, and I want to include all of us in that process. But before we start talking about those two people, I have to spend a whole lot of time situating them because I'm a history professor, and we do that. And so the letter that identified Kamipele as a Hawaiian who'd come to California for work, and he lived among other Hawaiian men, and they'd come years before to work for a man called John August Sutter, or Sutter originally. He's a Swiss businessman. He got Mexican citizenship in order to get a chunk of California land. Sutter, there you have him looking Swiss as all get out in his mid-19th century. Sutter came to Mexican-occupied California in 1839, before the famous gold rush. And he brought a contingent of about 11 Hawaiians as laborers, and they were going to contract to work with him for 3 years. Sutter had access to the land because Mexico, which was the colonial power claiming this territory, this Native American land, gave him a large land grant at the east side of the Sacramento River at a point where of its confluence with the American River. So the southern edge of this is where the city of Sacramento, the capital of California, now sits. Now, this was largely a territory of whom? Of Nisenan Maidu-speaking people and Miwok-speaking people who lived in villages in that area. Now, when we think about California in this period, many of you are going to think about Mexico, you're going to think about Franciscan missions, and those were very important, but this is pretty far north in California. It was beyond the reach of the Mexican state, of the Mexican government, and the closest the Spanish missions got was a place called Mission San Jose, which is like 100 miles to the south, located near Ohlone-speaking village called Oloisum. Now, some Nisenan people had labored or been baptized or enslaved at that mission, but it was pretty far away. And the Russian Empire was present too, but they were pretty far away. They were all the way over on the coast at a place called Fort Ross. So when Sutter came into this place where the American River flowed into the Sacramento River and he set up his fort there, it was the first direct and long-term incursion of outsiders in the homeland of the Nisenan and Miwok speaking people. Now, what did he want to do there? He wanted to take this homeland of the Nisenan and the Miwok, and he wanted to turn it into a proprietary fiefdom. He wanted to call it, or he did call it, Nueva Helvetia in Spanish, New Helvetia in fancy English, or New Switzerland in regular everyday language. And so what was this new Switzerland going to be? This is what the fort looked like, okay? New Switzerland, or New Helvetia, was built by a team of workers, mostly Kanaka, mostly Hawaiians who he had contracted work with him, and native Californians, some of whom he contracted, some of whom he captured and enslaved. And they built for Sutter a trading fort that was modeled on the Hudson Bay Company fur trading post at that was called Fort Vancouver up in Salish territory on the Columbia River. And so Sutter's settlement was built within a few miles of two Nisenan villages, one called Pushuni and one called Kedemba. Both of them now lie under the Sacramento city area. And Hawaiians and native Californians worked together for Sutter under his tyrannical rule. He was a violent man. Of the many people who have hospitals and counties and wonderful institutions named after them, this is truly a person where we would want to think twice. He was truly a piece of work. But Sutter now, he for 10 years, by 1848, he'd had these people working for him. But he had built the colonial dream that he wanted, but he built it out of adobe. And as a Swiss man, he did not want adobe. He wanted something that looked a little bit more European. He wanted frame architecture. He wanted wood architecture. But to do it for that, you need a lumber mill because there's no way you're going to get any wood out there. So what he did is he purchased the remains of the Russian Fort Ross, which they'd had to abandon out on the Pacific coast. Then he had his contracted and enslaved labor disassemble the buildings, haul the lumber up to the Sierra Nevada mountains to a Nisenan-speaking village called Coloma. And at Coloma, they took those buildings, made a new mill, and they were going to cut and mill lumber up in the lower Sierra Hills. That was a lovely plan. They started building, but as they did that, someone looked in the stream and they saw a curious glint in the stream and they said, that's gold. And that's worth a lot to the outside world. Now, the native people knew there was gold there and they thought it was lovely, but it served no economic purpose for them. So therefore, they'd never made a big deal of it. But gold transformed California, of course. There was a gold rush as the world learned of this gold in 1849. And Sutter was transformed by it. He was a failure of businessman, failed to make any money after the gold rush. He left California, but of course the native people remained, as did the number of his contracted Kanaka workers, which included some people that came in 1839 and others that he hired afterward. So bear with me, all this is context, okay? So I'm going to get back to Sinamayan and Kamepele, but I want you to show the world that this story is happening in. So in 1849 begins this gold rush. And thousands and thousands of people come to pour into this area. Americans, okay, so people from what we call the United States, right? From the eastern part of this continent, many Mexicans, many Chinese, many Chileans, many Europeans pour in. They're inundating Maidu and Miwok and Nisenan and Ohlone and other homelands in the area that they simply call the Southern Mines. Also, many more Kanaka, many more Hawaiians pour in as well. Because now Hawaii, this might seem surprising to you, but I really want you to think about ships going back and forth between Honolulu and San Francisco. It was an easy trip. It was easy to jump on a trip for a young person who wanted to make his fortune. Right. So they're jumping. So many got on the ships that the kingdom outlawed emigration, which was a nice law, but it's pretty hard to enforce when people are seeking gold. which they've been told is right, and easy to get to. So the Hawaiians, there had always been Hawaiians around, but the number exploded. And what this meant was, here you have pictures, the two pictures on the right vividly represent the large Chinese population in the mines. But again, I want you to imagine a very multicultural, multiracial situation. Now, when we imagine a multicultural and multiracial situation, first of all, let's remember that Nisenan and Miwok people were in the direct line of fire. So I apologize for this graphic, but that large kind of oval that slants to the lower right, that's the Southern Mines area. It runs through the Nisenan, Maidu, Kankau, Nisenan, Washoe, Miwok, Southern, and then Yokut speaking areas of the Central Valley of California and going up into the hills in the lower Sierra. And they inundated the area. Now, so the first thing that many of these settlers who came in, especially American settlers, okay, wanted is, of course, they wanted the gold. To get access to the gold, they need to get access to the land. And native people whose land they had just invaded were seen as an impediment. They were seen as interlopers. They were seen as illegitimate in their own lands in the eyes of white Americans. And so there was a massive genocide which began. The new state of California endorsed, encouraged, and funded violent attacks and enslavement of native Californian people. The fullest accounting of these attacks is a book called American Genocide by Ben Madley, who teaches at UCLA. And the most direct attacks on villages, the burning of villages, the enslavement of whole swaths of people, were done by white men. But in addition to the kind of the direct genocidal violence, there's also a lot of other violence that happens. That's the violence to the land and to the rivers upon which native Californian people depended for survival. And so the cutting down the trees, the destructions of the streams, first by panning and then through the redirection of water through flues into something called placer mining, all the runoff from that ruined the environment for people who depended on the land for their subsistence. And I've seen no evidence that the many native Hawaiian miners were any better than white miners in this area, though they did not engage in the direct violence. So in that way, the native Hawaiian miners were like white miners, but their race changed something very dramatically for them. And that was, not only did white Americans look at native people as being in the way, but they looked at non-white miners as being an important problem. Okay, they look at Mexicans, Chileans, Chinese, and native Hawaiians as having no right. They called them foreign miners, which of course is ironic because they're all foreigners in this native land. I mean, they're foreign to California, they're foreign to Mexico. They take over this area, and yet they invent something called the foreign miners license. And then the foreign miners tax in 1950 and 1851 and 1852. The goal of this was to make mining unprofitable for native people. And this was to supplement direct violence. Excuse me, not on native people, on Indian people who had started to engage in mining, but also any other non-white people who were how they defined non-white. So they tried to, through violence and by making it too expensive for non-white miners to remain, they tried to get them to leave. Now, some continued to mine, often as employees of white miners, okay? So they moved from seeking their own stake and mining for their own benefit to mining as employees. Some continued to try to mine independently, but it was very difficult. And so one of the places that they did this was a place called Irish Creek, which is going to be very hard for you to see, and I apologize for that. I believe they gave me a clicker with a pointer. There we go. So, okay. Oh, yeah. It works better that way. All right. Okay, so here's the Sacramento River, right? And I started off at Vernon, which is here called Verona because the name changed. Here's Sacramento, where Sutter built his first fort. Here are the foothills, and here's the valley. And then all these dots show the dense network of villages, most of which are alongside the rivers. Makes sense, right? And as what happened as white miners chased people of color, native people and people of color out of this area, two things happened. One is there became kind of a few concentrations of native miners. So for example, at Irish Creek here, at Kanaka Bar and Kanaka Peak up here, these were areas where many native Hawaiian miners went. Many other people, I'm about to tell you, went down into the valley. And when I say into the valley, I mean here, because they could no longer find a living that was going to work for them up in the hills. So they went down into the valley. So that's kind of the geography I'm going to be telling you about. Now, so a lot of Hawaiian and men, following the general pattern of miners of color, abandoned mining. They moved down to the river valley. And now what did they do down there? Well, Hawaiian men had since the late 18th century been working in maritime trades. They'd been working in whaling, in transoceanic, and now they took a number of them took those skills and they worked on the riverboats. So went up and down the Sacramento River and were crucial to the development of this economic region, going between Sacramento, Yuba City, Marysville, Oroville, Fremont, and the Bay of California. And those riverboats were serving the miners and the agricultural economy that was growing as Ohlone speakers, Miwok speakers, Nisenan Maidu speakers, Patwin speakers, Yana speakers, and those people are being chased out of the arable parts, the farmable parts of this rich river valley. And really, it is extraordinarily beautiful farmland. You can't, I mean, if you haven't driven through this area, which is not where most people go to California, it's like, it's flat, it's rich, and and so enormous wealth was built on the homelands of these native people. So Hawaiian people started working in the riverboats that built this economy. They also started to build a life as commercial fishermen on the Sacramento River, mostly in the stretches below the Sacramento's confluences with the Feather and the American. In other words, between Vernon and Sacramento. There's a lot of, not only did this put you in a nice distance to the market at Sacramento, because you want to sell fish fresh and quickly, so you're going to be near a city if you're going to be a commercial fisherman, but also it's a really rich ecological zone because you have these multiple rivers flowing together. So you have a lot of different species, different seasons are fishable. So it's very profitable. Now, a lot of historians, Charles Ken, Ashley Riley Souza, Gary Okihiro, Greg Rosenthal, myself, have noted that some native Californian and native Hawaiian men established relationships, which I will imperfectly call marriages here, and had children. And in many cases, those men and their children entered into native Hawaiian families. It was a pattern that was present at Sutter's New Helvetia. It was a pattern that was present in the gold fields, in the river fishing trade, and many of these couples were present in all of these spaces as the economy and as white violence and policy was making it difficult for them to stay in one space. So here we have a picture of Pamela Clenso. Pamela is probably a wedding picture would be my guess, given the nature of the photograph, probably taken at a studio in Sacramento. Pamela Clenso was a native Californian woman. She was a Nisenan speaker who was probably a native of the village of Pushuni, who grew up at Kadema, and then married later on a Hawaiian man named John Kapu'u or Kapu. And he labored at New Helvetia in the 1840s. Now, I want you to notice that New Helvetia, this fort, Sutter's Fort, was only a few miles from her home village. And when gold fever struck, she was found later in the gold fields. Later, she was with Kapu at Vernon, which was also in the home territory of her people, which is the same village where Kamipele wrote that song for Sinamayan. By the 1860s, that village of Vernon seems to have been made up entirely of native Hawaiian men, native Californian women, and their children. Now, it's hard to know exactly who lived there. I have a slide that is in the wrong place, so I'm skipping it. Okay. Something's going on with me. Sorry, I have some slide order problems. Okay. All right. But the 1860s, that village is established, and it lasts for about 50 years, 60 years. Census returns from 1860 to 1910 generally show a few households of people clustered under 25 people. I'm sorry, I'm just having a little trouble with my slides, so I'm going to skip that. But so when the census went out to find people, they didn't find that many. They would say they found 20 or 30 people, maybe a few large households. We really can't trust those numbers to give us a number of how many people were living at Vernon, because they were engaged in migrant labor. The fisher people moving up and down the river, selling outside, many people working in the river boats, on the river boats and dwelling on the river boats. Many young men who worked as snag boys, which are people who would clear debris from the river so that river boats could pass through more easily. Then later on, migrant agricultural labor, picking in the hop fields, working in the development of the fruit industry, etc. But Vernon was the home base for a larger group of people. The village site was right along the Sacramento River, and it was on a promontory, originally probably kind of a sandbar that juts out below a bit of a bluff below the levee that the state of California established in order to hold the floodwaters of the Sacramento back in the springtime so as not to inundate the now very valuable agricultural lands, which are a little bit further away from the river. Being Native Hawaiian and Native Californian people, that levee was built to hold the water kind of on top of their village. So the flooding was just really, really terrible in the springtime in Vernon. The village seems to have existed on the land of the settler family that owned the farm above the levee, on the other side of the levee. Maybe they paid rent, maybe they did not. It's not entirely clear to me. But they stayed there until about 1916. In 1916, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was conducting a survey of American Indian communities in California, happened upon these people, gave them the name, the Sacramento and Verona Band of Homeless Indians, because they had cousins who lived down in Sacramento as well, about 18, 20 miles to the south. So what Washington said is, you can't live here anymore, but we're going to buy you another piece of land. And do you want that? And they said, yes, we'd like that. And it sounds good. And so they bought for them a piece of land at a place called Shingle Springs in El Dorado County. Now, El Dorado County, this is considerably uphill and environmentally very different. You cannot be a fisher person in El Dorado County because there's just a small creek that runs through here. And given the vagaries of rain in California, it's not even a very dependable creek, right? And so not only was this land economically difficult to use for people who fish, it was also really hard to get to. It was rocky, there's very little level land, so nobody moved there. It remained undeveloped for a very long time. It wasn't until the 1970s that the descendants of the people of Verona moved to these new reservation lands. And now more than half of the people live there. And they're called the Shingle Springs Rancheria. So their name changed when they were moved from the Sacramento River, when they moved up there, finally in the 1970s, they took the name of the place where they lived. Now, that's the story of the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians, told very briefly in the context of a very quickly changing California. And I gave all of that because I want to let you think about Nisenan and Kamipele with me, because in order to understand her song and his mourning, we need to know about their world. And so it's here finally that I can get to memory. And memory, I'm going to talk about three. Kamipele's commemorative poem for Nisenan, then a Native Hawaiian historian named Charles Ken, and then finally contemporary memory at Shingle Springs, and a current community history project that I'm doing with the folks up at Shingle Springs, and which is the subject of the talk that I'm giving you today. As I talk about these three ways of remembering this past, I want to encourage you to think about how different people have conserved different truths in their memory, because those different truths are what they needed at different times. They served particular purposes for them. So let's start with Kamipele in the 1860s, go to Charles Ken in the middle of the 20th century, and then come up to the contemporary memory here in the first third of the 21st century. Going back to Kamipele and this Kaniko. Now, as I said, Kanaka men and Native Hawaiian women, Native American women on the Pacific coast were part of that history. Kamipele and Sinamayan were part of that history. Now, to a large extent, the story of the coming together of these men and these women fits a pattern that we see in broader histories of intermarriage in the context of trade colonialism. So think here in Minnesota, in the upper Midwest, we think of the fur trade, right? And we think about the emergence of many families of mixed ancestry, of French Canadian ancestry, of French or French Canadian ancestry, and of Indigenous ancestry. Further north and further west in Canada, many of these were families that came out of Scottish trading families with Scottish men and Indigenous women. And when we talk about this in this familiar pattern, we emphasize that these marriages, which is a very imperfect word, that these marriages served multiple parties, that the man and the woman and the societies that each of them came from recognized these marriages after a fashion because of the benefits that came from them. It made trade possible. It created large networks. It helped foreign men enter into kinship networks. It had diplomatic purposes, so on and so forth. There's a truth to this, but I want you to notice that it's fundamentally a structural truth. It's about the structural utility of a human relationship for how societies are coming together. How does that work? That's important to do, but it's, I would say, only a starting point, and it's very external to the relationship between these two people. It's a very external way of looking at a family. And our understanding as historians often stops there, and in part because we're interested in the structures of trade and diplomacy, but also because we lack the sources and we lack the knowledge of the social context to give it a deeper human dimension. And this is one of the reasons that this poem is so important to me, is it gives us the human dimension, because it speaks directly how this Hawaiian man thought about his native Californian wife, Sinamayan. It also speaks to how he wanted other people to see him thinking about her, right? I mean, and I don't mean to take away from that, but he's mourning in public, right? So he's sending a message about the kind of person that he is, right? And so we get to get inside a little bit of what he expects or what he thinks people expect for him. And it helps us understand a few things, insights that we miss if we just catalog genocidal horrors. Now, strictly speaking, this is not just a poem, it's a song. It's a mourning song in particular. And there were many, many of these that were published in Hawaiian newspapers in this period. They're lyrical, they're highly emotional, and they have certain conventions, generic conventions. By generic, I'm not putting it down like generic green beans, which aren't as good as the name brand green beans, but they're fitting a poetic genre. They're following rules. And his poem does follow that. And for example, he starts in this way. I'll read my English translation. My dear woman, from the stillness of California, from the cold wind of the Northwest, it's a small wind, but it numbs my whole body. My body aches with love. So at the most fundamental level, we see love. Kamipele's expressions of love are unmissable. His references to the ache that fill him and to the cold and to the wind, these are conventional in Kaniko, because part of mourning is feeling cold. It's a physical way of expressing how sad you feel. Even numbness is a way of talking about that we see a lot. So the poetry is following certain generic conventions, but the emotions are not. They're very specific, and they happen in a specific place. He mentions, for example, the cold northwest wind, the nuaiki. And that's a word that exists in Hawaiian from very early on that's borrowed from English. It comes from the English word northwest. And it has to do with the long connection of Hawaii with the Pacific Northwest of the North American continent. So that is a way of situating that in a place. It's also a kind of romantic love that situates the way that Native Hawaiian, Native Californian pairings evaded, we're outside of, we're not part of the norms of settler marriage as we expect them in the United States. For example, Sinamayan, Kamipele says that Sinamayan had a number of Kanaka Kane, about Native Hawaiian husbands. Now, I think that what he's suggesting is that there's a long series of men with whom she had paired. Now, some of that probably has to do with the early death that many men working these trades faced, but it also has to do with a very strong comfort with serial monogamy, right? Which is something that I think much of American society is very comfortable with today. It's a different way of looking at male-female pairings and the way that they function in society. And it was one that made sense for Native Hawaiian people. It was one that's made sense for Native American people in California, in this part of California. The love for Sinamayan, the love for her people, the love for this place can't really be separated in the song. Kamipeli writes with lyric pastoralism. And this is really interesting because as a historian, when we talk about Native people, we talk about hardship, and that's true. But he doesn't want us only to see hardship. He also wants to see beauty and joy. They lived in the settlement of Kanaka and native Californians who fished the Sacramento, quote, driving fish with nets, chasing salmon, chasing sturgeon, which he calls beautifully the toothless shark of the river here. Because the sturgeon does look like a shark, but conveniently has no teeth, which is a big advantage. And he talks about with affection. He talks about joyful people driving fish with nets, the spray of the river flying above, pulling the net when the whistle sounds. So you can sense the pleasure, the excitement of the labor on the water. So for all the sadness of commemorating a spouse who's passed away, of Wahine who has passed away, and the love that surrounds it, it reminds us of romantic love and collective happiness. It even celebrates her in an erotic sense, which would not be familiar in laments and mourning in the Western Christian tradition. It does this metaphorically. He says, aloha, or farewell, the rolling of the steamboat's wheel, the boat sails, sounding the horn, so the gates of the wharf will be opened. Branner's wheel tries as hard as it can. The Branner was a riverboat. The Branner's wheel is pumping, it's trying as hard as it can, the smooth gliding puffing of the Sacramento. It's an erotic metaphor, okay? It's an erotic metaphor for their sexual union, which I think is absolutely lovely. That as he's mourning her, even as she's passed around, he's remembering the joys of their shared erotic life, right? That's not foreign to him celebrating. It fits, and it fits within the genre, and it's an expression of the life. And that life is a river life. Their life is defined by the river. And he says, there is no one like you here on the river. You're unparalleled. Awe, which is how we say alas. Awe, my dear Wahine, my dear woman, the companion I have cared for, my dear Wahine from the river of Sacramento, this river that we sail upon. But that river is also going to be a path, and he's a lovely poet. And so this river is first where he lives, but it's also where he needs to conduct her spirit. And he conducts her spirit down a path of rivers. He says, my woman of the Cosumnes River. So we find out where she's from originally. This is great information, by the way. My woman of the Cosumnes River that comes to Mokolumne City. The eyes travel from Amador above in the foothills down to Liberty. This town, standing alone, wondrous on the plain. Look at the upland of the Mokolumne River. That is the place to leave your body and leave us two behind. So that's the place to leave your body and to ascend to the next part of your existence, right? I find it profoundly touching. I find it also an incredible historical document because it takes someone that appeared in our history as an Indian woman, gives her a name, gives her a home village, places that village on a river, talks about the things that she loved to do, talks about the labor that they shared, and then tells her, and it also fulfills a very important spiritual function. Because previously, it was important, or it was still important, but it was very difficult to take a body home, to cremate that body to its home place, and so that that spirit could proceed properly into the world of the spirits and be with the ancestors appropriately. In the context of the genocidal gold rush invasion of California, that was probably too dangerous. He probably could not get her body up there to cremate it. So what he did is he merged a Miwok-speaking spiritual requirement of a mourning man or lover, or a deceased woman or lover, with a Hawaiian poetic form. And through poetry and song, he fulfills two ritual requirements in two different spiritual traditions. The Native Hawaiians tradition of taking somebody through a tour of their home places and remembering them and sending their spirit forward. And discursively in the song, he talks about leaving her body there and then ascending. So that's beautiful. It's beautiful poetry. It's beautiful work. It's an amazing historical document, and it is suffused with love. And as a person who has to spend a lot of time reading land documents and inheritance documents, finding a document that's filled with love doesn't do me any harm. It does my soul a lot of good. So I'm very grateful for Thomas Kamipele for having written this. But I want to take us back to Vernon in 1873, to this place. Taking a look at my clock. Good, we're actually doing very well. All right, so that's the song that I want you to see that he did. And at that point, the memory of this place kind of starts to go away. One of the last times that we see any reference to this place in print is in the Hawaiian language, and the Hawaiian language newspaper, now in something called the Territory of Hawaii, because United States imperialism had taken over the Hawaiian kingdom. And he's reporting, John Wilson is a member of the Vernon community. He goes back to Hawaii, and this piece about his trip home to see family and friends back in Honolulu appears in the paper. And after that, they fall out of sight. They fall out of sight, I think, for a couple of reasons. For one reason, a lot of the documents about them had been in the Hawaiian language because the men could read and write in Hawaiian and send things back. But now their children and their grandchildren probably can't read and write in the Hawaiian language. They might not even be able to speak the Hawaiian language, super fluently. It's still one of the languages of the village, but it's not the same thing. Also, those relatives that they were keeping in touch with back, now instead of being their brothers and sisters or even their cousins, they're like second cousins. They're more distant family. So the connection to Hawaii is not as strong. Poverty is a really important part of this. The Hawaiian, and then meanwhile, the marginalization of Native Californian people in California was very extreme. The erasure of their presence was very extreme. It wasn't until the middle of the 20th century that a man named Charles Ken, a Kanaka, a Native Hawaiian person, a kahuna, a spiritual expert, and a very erudite man, came across the records of this community, and he wanted to write a book about it. And he, with a research colleague who lived in Sacramento, studied their history through documents. They recontacted descendants in the community, did some oral histories, and Ken wanted to write a book. He thought it was a wonderful story, and he was right. But he never quite got the book done. And as a writer, I am very sympathetic for him for that. But he did number a part of articles. But I want you to see something about these articles. The very titles of the articles tell you that he put Hawaiians at the middle of this story. These are the titles: Descendants of Captain Sutter's Kanakas, Sutter's Hawaiians, Hawaiians in the Gold Rush, Sutter's Kanakas, Sutter's Kanakas. This is how he understood these people, as Hawaiians. But I mean, it's not that they weren't Hawaiians, but they're also Native Californians. And they made their lives as Native Californians. And the problems that they faced generation after generation were Native Californian problems of land loss, of linguicide, of mass incarceration, of lack of access to employment. It was a Native Californian history. But as a Hawaiian who's very much involved in perpetuating the Hawaiian tradition and hoping for a good future for the Native Hawaiian people, centers their Hawaiianness. I understand the reason why he did that, but I also want us to see that there's a problem there, right? It takes away part of the truth of this community, and we need to recognize the complexity of that, just as the poem that Kamipele wrote for Sina Mayang recognized the complexity of that. Many of his stories centers on that Ken researched on a man named Henry Asbill. Henry Asbill communicated, was a Native Californian, Native Hawaiian person, the child of Mary Asbill, who you can see in this wonderful late 19th century portrait, looking magnificent. Mary Asbill was a very important figure, and it remains an important figure in the memory of the Machupta Maidu people near Chico, California. She was half Hawaiian, half Maidu, and she spent time in this mixed community in California, but also went back to Hawaii and lived there, worked in the court of Queen Liuokalani, the last queen of the Hawaiian kingdom, was the standard bearer for her. So she was not marginal to native Californian life. She was not marginal to native Hawaiian life. She was fully a part of that. And her son, Henry, wanted people to know this. And he told these stories, he published, he wrote stories in the 1960s. But over time, he became himself more and more involved in his native Californian ancestry. It's not that he ever denied his Hawaiianness, it meant a lot to him. But he became a preserver and a proponent of Maidu heritage and Maidu survivance. And much of what we know, we are grateful to Henry Asbel for having written it down or spoken it in the 60s and 70s. That memory went on, and it was partly passed on to a man named Harry Fonseca. Harry Fonseca is part of the Shingle Springs community, or was. He's unfortunately passed away. He was one of the most important Native American painters of the 1970s and 80s, and they passed away in the 90s. His work merged traditional themes and modern motifs. In the lower right, you see Coyote in a very urban setting, in a very urban outlook, and his leather jacket and his boots. And so what he was doing, what Harry was saying, this memory does not need to remove one from the other. It does not to remove us from the present. We are part of this present. And he is very much celebrated today as an elder in Shingle Springs. The Shingle Springs Rancheria, as I told you, located in El Dorado County. In 2020, shortly before the pandemic really came down, I got an email from a woman named Sigrid Benson, who works in the cultural division at the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians. And they'd stumbled across my work because I'd been interviewed for a podcast about Native Hawaiians abroad. And she and her colleague, Jackie Calancini, who you see at the top center, said, do you realize you're talking about the ancestors? And I said, I have no idea because the federal government renamed them and moved them, so I lost track of y'all. She said, well, that's our families. Would you talk to tribal council about this? So I gave a Zoom talk to the tribal council on this history, and they said, that was great. Let's do another one. So I did another one with the tribal council. And then they said, will you talk to the general membership via Zoom? And so I did a talk to the general membership of the Shingle Springs Band over Zoom as well. And then because they were so interested that their heritage was well documented in the Hawaiian language, and they don't have access to that language anymore, I said, do you want some Hawaiian lessons? So we did about 5 months of Hawaiian lessons for, for the group of people that were interested in it. It was just amazing. It was terrific. And we built a friendship. And at the end of that friendship, eventually we kind of approached each other, and I approached them and they approached me. And we thought, what if we did a community history together? And one that's for you, that takes these fractured stories and tries to create something that's useful to you now and useful to your children in the future and your grandchildren. And so that's what I'm currently doing. And one of the things that blows me away is if you go to the tribal administration building and the rancheria, you'll see that memory work is at the center of Nisenan, of Shingle Springs Band of Miwok and Nisenan endeavor right now. So there are pictures up, there's physical manifestations of traditional culture up, there's oral history being taken, there's story being taken, Harry Fonseca's art is up. All of these ways of keeping the past present and telling stories about the past that are relevant to the present and to the future are at the center of what they're doing. And at the center of that story are women. All of the members of the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians are descended by definition from two women. One of them is Pamela Quenso, you saw a picture of her before, and the other was Annie Hill. And their numerous husbands, their numerous male partners, and numerous kane. And so I went out there, and I've been out there a number of times now. And one of the things that's very important is when you're doing history is, what is your research question? And so I had to ask them, what are the questions that you want to talk about? One of the questions was safety. And something that's very important to know is that Native Californian people were not safe. There was massive violence against them, and they were liable to abduction, to enslavement, to attack. And many of the descendants for a couple generations of these mixed families identified publicly as Native Hawaiians, even though they were proudly Native American people. And this included the matriarchs, Pamela Clenso and Annie Hill. And there's a very strong consciousness of that that we need to talk about. And that they're very, at Shingle Springs, folks were very comfortable talking to me about that. And it's a very strongly gendered story of safety, because it's about Native Californian women sometimes needing Native Californian women, sometimes needing Native Hawaiian men to be safe in those times. We need to transform our prepositions. I'm working with this community, not on this community. It's been collaboration from the beginning, and I'm thrilled by that collaboration. The first research question that the Shingle Springs people are interested in is clarifying the geographical origins of the Nisenan women from whom they all descend. And this is important because it demonstrates how the contemporary community members remain rooted in their homeland, despite all of the disruptions of American colonialism. The second research question is how and why did Hawaiian ancestors enter into Native California communities between the 1830s and 1900? This is important because it counters the idea that they ceased being Native American people when they intermarried with Native Hawaiian people, that they could incorporate outsiders while remaining the people that they are. It's a Native community with the capacity for resilient change. And finally, how their ancestors managed to remain a community over the many years stretching from the loss of their village back in 1916 to the move to the modern reservation, which happened like 70 years later. And because that's important, because it shows the means of social cohesion, continuity, connecting the past to the future. All of this is memory work. I love doing it. It's a privilege of mine to do it. It's the biggest thrill of my entire career. And I'm hoping that it will be useful to them. I know that I am learning a lot from it. Mahalo. Thank you for letting me speak to you today.
Thank you very much. You said that when Sutter first came out to that area, he had Hawaiians that he contracted with. How did he encounter them? Were they already in North America, or did he go to Hawaii? How'd they connect?
What a great question. Okay, so Sutter had come across land and he had gotten to Fort Vancouver. When he got to Fort Vancouver, which is a Hudson's Bay Company fur trading port, a lot of the employees there were Native Hawaiian, and he liked what he saw. Then, in order to get down to San Francisco, the route that he took was a ship to Honolulu and then a ship down to San Francisco. He got to Honolulu expecting to be able to get on a ship quickly down to San Francisco. That didn't work out. So he was there for several months. And at that time, he worked with the kingdom government to allow him to contract some laborers to take him. So it was partly by example, and it was partly also because of the opportunity when he was basically stranded in Honolulu for a while.
Was that early migration of Hawaiians to the Fort Vancouver area, was that a voluntary economic migration, or were they conscripted essentially for labor?
I think they were voluntary migrants. I have not seen indication they would be conscripted. Many Hawaiians, especially young men, were embarking on overseas labor. They got on whale ships, they got on, merchant vessels, and they worked all of that trade. And this became, and working in the fur trade, kind of in the western coast, became an extension of that. I think they were seeking fortune. I think they were seeking adventure. I think they were engaging in that dynamic world of the early 19th century in a way that made sense for them. Sometimes when they got there, they found it hard to get back. And that was what happened with a lot of these Hawaiians in California as well. They thought they were going to go make $1 gazillion, return back and set up their family and everything would be great. Migration doesn't always work that way. And I think they sometimes got stuck and had a hard time affording a way to home. Jacob's bringing the mic now.
Oh, it's good.
I'm curious about the male partners,
Yeah.
the men. Are you, in your creation of this history, looking back to the origins in Hawaii to see how those men and the villages or the places that they came from either influenced or enriched the history? Does that complete something, or is that an element that's not part of the research? You're
Well,
really focused on Shingle Creek.
Very sensitive, important question. And it's very important to the Jingle Springs people. I kind of, my original inclination was to really emphasize Native Californian ancestry identification and ways above all others. And there's an element of that as well. But these people care a lot about those male ancestors as well. And they, for generations, have identified as Hawaiian people as well as California Native people. And so it's very important to them in a way that's very fundamental and makes a lot of sense, both for Native Hawaiian culture, but also for many indigenous ways of living in the world. They always want to know exactly where these men were from. Where is their home? Because I want to know where that is. I want to be able to name that site. I want to be able to visit that place and know that place because that land produces that person. I have a kinship to that land. So therefore, knowing the places and telling the men's stories is important. Also thinking about the way that the culture was dynamic and could, and that Native Hawaiian culture could enter into this Native Hawaiian, the Native Californian culture, the Shingle Springs culture, and be part of it is also important to see how hula, how song, how language remained part of the community for a very long time and still do today. Hula is still practiced. Hawaiian language is still a thing. A love for Hawaii is still a thing. But to me, what's really important is to show that this is actually a story that reveals something about the dynamism of this Native Californian culture, that it has the confidence, that has the ability to embrace cosmopolitanism, right? That never takes away from who they are as Native Californian people. So yes, I am talking about it, but it was an important thing for me to work out in conversation with my partners there.
I was struck by the 1916 date. We were in the middle of war in Europe. It was an election year, presidential election year. In fact, I think California actually settled the Wilson's victory that year. What was happening in the Verona area that prompted them to move the native peoples from the river into the hills? It was not a census year, so I was struck by what prompted that in that 1916 period.
Oh, very canny question. The early stirrings of the progressive movement, which were going to be an important historical, kind of trajectory, and was going to ultimately lead to something, to transformation, temporary in 1934 with the Indian Reorganization Act and a whole lot of policies that were going to try to, rather than destroy Native American people, to, okay, in a very kind of patronizing way, make space and allow them to thrive and things like that. So there is an element of that that's going on, but it wasn't just Shingle Springs that was the object of BIA attention. All of California was, because you see, in 1850, 1851, a series of treaties were signed between Native Californian people and the United States government. They were sent to Washington because all treaties need to be ratified by the Senate, right? And the California senators were made sure that those treaties were buried, okay? They buried them deep and hard. And so what you had is a lot of people, what the federal government called homeless Indians, landless people. So they had surrendered massive amounts of extraordinarily valuable land, and yet they had nothing. So you have basically, landless laborers, people living catch as catch can in a whole lot of economies. So that social crisis had started to come into the vision of officials at the Office of Indian Affairs, now the Bureau of Indian Affairs, same thing. And they said, well, let's try to find a place to put these people. Let's buy them some land. Let's buy them some cheap land. Let's move them there. And so it was kind of a very strange, it's kind of early progressive policy and it's late reservation policy. And they're coming together at the same, in 1916.
Before I go to a couple, is there any online questions? Nope. Okay. Just want to make sure.
Yeah, I guess my question is around thinking about exile and memory.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if you could speak to, so I'm thinking about Native Hawaiians that left Hawaii and came to what was, California. Were there, in your research or conversations or in your own, did Native Hawaiians in California feel like they were in exile, feel like they were still in relationship and community and in the constant memory of their Hawaiian people back in the homeland?
Oh, wow, what a great question. I think for a long time, they felt like they were away from home. I'm not sure if they felt like they were in exile, but I see the exile. I think after a time, people felt like they were in exile. I want to talk about multiple people's experiences to try to answer this because I can't speak about all of them. The initial hope at some time was, I'm here, things are going to go really well, I'm going to go home. And that was true for many people. Here, there's a survivor bias in this. There's a story. This is mostly about the people who stayed. A number of people went back. For example, somebody who's helping me translate these documents, Daniel Kauilamahi, at the University of Hawaii for the Shingle Springs folks. He's trying to give them a whole archive of all these documents. Said, hey, that's my great-great-grandfather. He was working in Sacramento. I didn't know that. So he went and he did that, and it's fine. And so that was a young person's experience abroad, if you will, for that person. For other people, I think it became that they were caught between nations, and they couldn't get back. And there are a number of very sad letters saying, telling other people, don't come here. Because if you do, you are going to be trapped. Your wages will be stolen. You'll be chased out of, the trade that you try to pursue. And you're not going to have money to get back. We can't get back. There's some very sad talk about the leaving of the bones in the foreign land, the inability to go home, to die there, or to be buried there. So it's that real sense of lack. And then there's a mixture. So there's successful return. There's a feeling of displacement or exile, if you will. And then there's, I think, a mixture where it's a homeland, but this is a different homeland. And I think these things evolved over generations. The transformation, the political transformation of Hawaii with the overthrow of the kingdom in 1893 and the occupation by the United States starting in 1898 doesn't show up in these documents in Hawaiian very well, because by the time that was happening, very few of them are being produced. I'm very curious how people felt about that, and I don't know. Because it's at that point that exile might really start to feel like a very strong word, and a very appropriate word.
David, I have a question from a Zoom participant, and they ask, were men of all the Hawaiian Islands migrating or seeking fortune, or were they typically from Oahu?
Great question. Okay, all the islands. Okay, so just in the communities that were at the places that I study the most, definitely Oahu, Big Island, okay, University, Hawaii Island, Maui is represented, Molokai is represented, all of them. I would say there's a lot from Oahu because the port in Honolulu is being so important. But there's also a lot of internal migration within the Hawaiian kingdom at this time. So you could very easily end up in Honolulu for a few years, even though your home was originally Kula Maui or, or Hilo, Hawaii. So there's an emphasis on Oahu, but it's definitely not where everybody's from.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was really interested in the kind of framing that you have of the work of memory and kind of pulling from it the truths that people need in the moment. And I think I can see that in your work, really trying to address the specific needs of a specific community in the present. I'm curious as a historian, if you think much about the future in that context as well? What might be useful to people in the future, what they're going to need in the future, or is that just sort of unknowable in the present?
We're doing our best. And no, but I mean that not humorously, but sincerely. I mean that as a citizen. I mean that as a father. I mean that as a member of my communities that I am a part of. And absolutely. One thing about most Indigenous history is we're not doing it. It's not about the past. It's about the future. It is not for the past. It is for the future. It is for a better future. It's for future generations. So you're talking about ancestors to grandchildren who are not yet born, ultimately. And I feel like, and I do that in all of my work, I feel that many of my colleagues, whether we name it or not, when we're doing Indigenous history, we're doing it that way because the world needs to be, the communities will be. It's a confidence in our future that it's going to be there, that Native people are not people of the past, they are people of the present and people of the future. But in order to do that, we need to think about coming generations. That is something that's a mark of Native history. And I think it's a proud mark. Sometimes that's looked upon, does not fit the conventions of normal academic history, of settler academic history, of European Central academic history, which emphasizes the need for a total analytical distance from the past, which I think is an abhorrent thing. It's generally intellectually dishonest because all of us study things that we care deeply about, right? And so naming your relationship to that is important. My relationship is very future oriented, and so is theirs. They want something that's going to be there, that will be helpful to them. And I know it's going to get superseded, right? Because this is how it will soon become superseded. It'll look outmoded in 15 years. Just like, you know, if I show a documentary to my students in class, it was made 15 years ago, they laugh, right? But this is how the world works, and that's fine. But at least I'm trying to put something useful out there. One thing about Indigenous history, especially this happens in various places, is all we are given in written sources is fragments of trauma, shards of a broken jar. And you can do nothing with that except lament. That's not what I want to be in the world, is saying, hey, look at this broken jar. Look how shattered we are. Or look how shattered you are. That does no good. As a teacher in the classroom down at the other end of University Avenue, I've learned from my students, especially working with my Native students, that is not my job, is to show them shards of trauma, but to create something useful and whole, right? And to give them, and part of that is to give them a story, right? It's not just gold rush, genocide, then I don't know what happened. Trauma, right? Let's give them a story that fits together. Otherwise, how are we here? How do we explain our present? But that very trajectory, just like Kamipele's trajectory, it goes to her past, it brings up to the present, and then it sends her forth on a future as she goes into the next world, right? Or into the next realm of her existence. I think that, you know, I'm not Kamipele, I'm not doing that, but I do think that all history in some ways implies a future. And so we had better be responsible in trying to make it as good as we can.
David, a question from Zoom would like to know, what language were the Hawaiian and the native Californians using to communicate with each other?
Very good question. Again, it's going to depend on generation. I think in the earliest days, you're going to see Hawaiian, native Californian languages, especially Nisenan, versions of Nisenan and the Miwok language, and English with Spanish mixed in. And then over time, I think you want to imagine, for example, in the 1860s, 1870s, this time that Kamipele is writing, I think we have multilingual communities where there's very clear documentation that Native Californian and mixed descent children could speak, read, and write in the Hawaiian language. Like I have some things written by Hanakapu, who's one of Pamela's former partner's children later on, and she's writing in the Hawaiian language. She's of mixed Nisenan Native Hawaiian descent. Then over time, English rises and supplants both of these languages. But in the early 20th century, the matriarchs and patriarchs, their English is shaky, you know, but their Hawaiian and Nisenan is probably, and Miwok is probably quite strong. One of the wonderful things that happened recently is I was out there a couple weeks ago, and they asked me to do, they said, the cultural division said, let's get a bunch of Hawaiian food catered in, and then you can do a language class on food words. And I was like, okay, let's do that. It'd be fun. It was great. People brought a lot of kids. You know, you always want as many kids as possible at anything that's language oriented. And so one of the things I taught them how to say is, I like such and such. Like, you know, I like fish. Make make au ika ia. And make make, I said, means to like or to want. It means both of those things. And one guy laughed hilarious. I was like, so what was so funny? He's like, that's what my great grandma used to always say. Just sometimes she would just exclaim it. You know what I mean? It seems to be an exclamation of happiness. She's like, oh, make make. You know what I mean? And so words continued to resonate even up to the present.
So first, I want to thank you so much for your talk. I grew up in California, spent an enormous amount of time in the Bay Area, Sacramento, Folsom, Vernon, all those areas, and never heard the story of the Hawaiian migrant and immigrants. So I'm just amazed by this, and I appreciate you bringing it forward. My question to you is, what brought you to the particulars of the Shingle Creek Reservation and how that whole thing came together?
Well, they came to me. Well, first of all, thanks a lot. And as you were in that area, it's not only the Native Hawaiian past that was absent to you, but I'm going to guess the Native American past was nearly invisible. It is frankly atrocious. It is frankly atrocious, the erasure of Native history or of Native present in California. It's astonishing. I mean, it's bad across the continent, but I was really surprised. So especially Folsom, that really is just as the core of this community. This is where this is these people's homelands. So they came to me because I first ended up studying these people because I was studying, as Dr. Roram said earlier, Hawaiian exploration of the world. So then I followed Hawaiians to California, and I followed some of these to Vernon, and I told incidentally about the communities at Vernon and Irish Creek, and then further north at Chico and places like that. Then I stopped working on it because I had done everything I could on that. So then they got in touch with me in 2020 because they had heard about my work, and they said, that's our family. And I said, oh, I didn't know that. And they were so generous that they asked me to share what I could with them. And then they were open to expanding that relationship. So it's the discovery is really more theirs than mine.
Any last questions? Well, again, join me in thanking Dr. Chang for coming. Check out his book in the bookstore. Also, hope to see you here on the 29th. And also, thanks for also impressing. I think every guest is always impressed by the quality of questions our audience brings. So keep it up.
Everybody gets an A.